Hi, in this video we're going to talk about the HyperWind technology that we have inside Forester, and we're going to see how we can control this wind to adapt itself to different tree types which require slight modifications on the wind parameters to get realistic wind effects happening. So in this case we have a palm tree where we have wind on, which we can increase and decrease to actually control it. I'm going to start with the default tree and then select different tree types from the library to see how we can control the wind for these major tree types. So I'm gonna hide the palm tree for now, and I'll create a new forester tree which I'll set to a default tree. And I'm gonna go to my HyperWind section and check the wind to be on. So whenever I press play, I get default gentle wind happening right away over the tree. And this is enough in case you just wanted to have an animated tree that has a slight breeze going through it. Now, of course, you can, with the HyperWind technology, simulate a more drastic or dramatic wind effect. Now, if I wanted to strengthen the wind, you would be tempted to go to the global wind multiplier and increase that value, but this will not give you the proper effect because although I did strengthen the strength of the wind, but the speed of the wind did not increase. So this is not really the proper solution. In real life, whenever the wind is strong, it means that the speed of that wind is getting stronger. So for that, I have to go down to the wind speed parameter under directional wind and actually increase that value. So if I go like this, I'm gonna increase the wind speed, and this will actually give me a much more realistic appearance. So if I set it to 1, then I would combine this with the global wind multiplier to actually have the wind go like this. Now you can increase the speed and you can increase the strength to get a very drastic wind effect. Another thing you can do is strengthen the wind along the trunk. So if you go down and increase the trunk wind, you're gonna get this. Now the trunk has a stiffness value which you can decrease to make the wind affect the trunk from the base. Alright, so reducing the speed will give you a less exaggerated result, and this is what I get by default. Now, whenever you have wind on, it means that the tree is rebuilt at every frame or every iteration in the scene, which will actually slow down your scene in case you have other objects. So to speed things up while keeping the wind, you can check the render time wind on. So whenever I play this, it's gonna play at full frame rate. Now it's not full because I'm recording this, but otherwise it's gonna play at full frame rate, while when you render, you're gonna be rendering the wind. So if I took this and rendered all frames, I'm gonna see that the wind is actually rendered. Now, since we are talking about wind and rendering, let's talk a bit about motion blur. If I go, for example, to my physical renderer and I want to use motion blur, and I actually render this, I'm gonna see that motion blur will not be respected by default. So here I don't see any motion blur happening beyond a few frames. For example, beyond frames 3 and 4, I don't see that the tree is actually moving properly. This is because the wind effect has to be cached. So if I go like this, I see that I lost any motion beyond frame 3. So now the tree is not moving at all. And this is because I need to cache the wind simulation. So it's not really a bug or a problem, but it's a step that I did not perform yet. So if I go to simulation and choose cache wind simulation, I see that keyframes are added, which take into effect the wind simulation. So if we go back to the HyperWind, even with just render time wind, if I render this now, I'm going to get the proper motion along with the proper motion blur. So let's give this a few frames to render. So here we see that we have the proper motion for the tree and the proper motion blur propagated along every frame. This, of course, is not restricted to the physical renderer, but to any render engine you have inside Cinema 4D. So using caching, you see that you get proper motion blur propagated over the tree render. Okay, so let's look at the other parameters that we have in the HyperWind section. I will delete this tree and create another one. We established that increasing the wind speed will actually give you a better wind simulation. Now, can you animate that speed to simulate a wind gusting effect? The answer is, of course, yes. So if I set my wind speed to a value of 0.3 and set a keyframe at the beginning and go, say, to frame 40 and set it to 1.5, set another keyframe, then yes, I can go from a low speed to a high speed wind, and then back to a low speed if I wanted to. And by just changing the position of that keyframe, you can just animate the transition from calm to windy tree. Alright, so let's continue on with the different parameters that we have. For the wind simulation, we have two wind models which are close to each other, but the wind model 1 does tend to keep the branches that are not facing the wind direction to be slightly unaffected. So if I set the wind model to 0, all the branches are affected. But if I set the wind model to 1, the branches, because this is the wind direction going along the x-axis, the branches that are opposite to that x or going along the negative x-axis has a lesser deformation value. So the wind direction is dictated from here. So if you change that direction, say to 180, now it's these branches that are not really affected by the deformation of the wind. So this happens whenever you have wind model set to 1. If you set it to 0, then all the branches are affected. So it's really up to you to choose whichever one you want to use. Now you can increase the multiplier, which is here, and you can dictate on which level the wind starts to take over. So if you set it, say, to 4 or to 5, it means that only the last level, because in this case it's level 5, it's only the last level that is getting affected by the wind. The tree is still moving because of the trunk wind effect that I have. If I set it to 0, it means that I'm just getting the last level of the branches to be affected by the wind. So really fine control over the wind start. So if I set it to 1, it means that all the branches are affected by the wind. So yeah, let's remove the animation from the wind speed and set it to a value of 1. Okay, so next on the list is the wind grow. If I set it to 0, I have no wind. If I set it to 1, then all the branches are affected by the wind. And you can animate the growth of the wind so that not all branches have the same wind effect. So if I increase this value, I see that some branches, for example, this one here, has stronger wind than another branch, say this one there. While if I increase it, then all branches have the same strength of the wind. The default value is 0.5, but you can play around to get the type of deformation that you're after. Now the wind global phase is whenever I have two trees and I don't want them to have the exact same wind deformation, because if I just play now, they have the exact same wind deformation. So if you change the phase for this one, then the wind is different for both. So you see that the animation is different because of the phase. If you set it down to 0, then the animation is exactly the same. So to really make sure, you can just place these two trees on top of each other and they would have the same deformation. But if you increase the phase, so now they are at a 90-degree phase offset, then the wind is different. Now notice that these two trees are exactly the same trees. It's just the wind that is different between the two. Of course, you can play with the growth to have them really different, but otherwise this is what the phase value is doing, and you see that you clearly have the same two trees but different wind effects applied to each one of them. Now the randomized wind grow, if you actually play with the wind grow and you don't have randomized wind grow on, you would actually start the wind from the top of the tree. So if you go like this, only the top of the tree is affected. So if I go like this, while the bottom is not affected. So these branches are affected more than the lower branches. If you want to reverse this, you can go like this, and the lower branches are affected more than the upper branches. If you randomize this, then the growth is affecting the branches randomly. Now the wind scale will have more random deformation for the individual branches, while if you increase it, the whole tree is going to move together as one unit. So if I really exaggerate the size, then the whole tree is moving together as one unit, while if I decrease it, the branches, but not 0, are going to have different deformations, like so. The wind complexity, if you increase it, you're going to get more detail in the deformation. A value of 1 is a good value to use. The randomized wind, if you increase this value, then the strength of the wind is going to be different between different branches. So here we see that the strength is different between different branches. If we decrease that, then all the branches have almost equal strengths. A default value of 0.25 is a good value to use. I'm going to stop here for this video and continue with the different global wind parameters in the next video.